Hi, Tim.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing great. Yeah, I'm here in wintry Washington D.C., but yeah, I'm everything's good.
Well, let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, publisher of the NonZero newsletter. This is the NonZero podcast. You're Timothy B. Lee, publisher of the highly regarded AI newsletter, Understanding AI. And also now you're doing podcast stuff yourself. So you're like a rival.
Yeah, I guess we're competitors now. I just this week, actually, it's January 14th, and just started publishing AI Summer, which is a newsletter about AI technology and policy, and it's a co-hosted interview show with Dean Ball, who is a AI policy expert at the Mercatus Center.
Okay, great. Well, I'll be checking it out. I'm sure it'll skyrocket to the top of my list of podcasts right up there with AI podcasts right up there with Cognitive Revolution and others. Well, as long as we're doing self-promotion, which, by the way, that was, Tim, you were doing self-promotion. I'm going to do some. As I said, this is the NonZero podcast associated with NonZero newsletter. We're actually doing some hiring at the newsletter / podcast. We're hiring, first of all, a journalist. I want to say print journalist, but some people take that to mean like ink on paper, which isn't what I mean. I just mean like words as opposed to video. Although there is also a position that could involve some video. We're also looking, first of all, for a part-time social media person, and maybe for a part-time person who does various things. They might propose themselves. For details, you can go to the NonZero newsletter at Substack, and on the homepage, you'll find a prominently posted thing on the left column, I think, that says NonZero is hiring. Details are there. And I want to say, I mean, if to look at the newsletter, you might think it does a lot of foreign policy. We do a lot of foreign policy, but we've done a lot more of that. And I do want to increasingly do things other than that. We cover tech. I want to do more of that, including especially AI and its impact on everything. And, we do a lot of stuff on kind of the psychology of tribalism, the sources of human conflict. And so if you check out our archives, including the posts on the right, I might say, which include some older ones, you'll get a sense for the sweep of the thing. But we encourage people to apply. So with that out of the way, I'm really looking forward to this conversation because I think we have a clearly defined theme here. And I think you and I are on somewhat different sides of this issue. So I want to set it up this way. Here's something that comes from Ethan Mollick's newsletter. I think you'll agree he's one of the most respected of the AI watchers and one of the most widely followed. He's a professor at Wharton. And he started out a recent post saying, recently something shifted in the AI industry. Researchers begin speaking urgently about the arrival of super smart AI systems, a flood of intelligence, not in some distant future, but imminently. They often refer to AGI, artificial general intelligence, defined, albeit imprecisely, as machines that can outperform expert humans across most intellectual tasks. This availability of intelligence on demand will, they argue, change society deeply and will change it soon. Now, you have been, Tim, something of a skeptic all along. I'm not sure so much about the eventual impact of AI, but certainly you've thought that a lot of people's timelines are a little too compressed and the things are going to unfold more slowly than we think. And I think you continue to think that. And I'm, the timelines are certainly uncertain, but I'm certainly a believer in the eventual magnitude of this thing, which I think very few people appreciate, honestly. But anyway, so why don't you start out by explaining why, there have been recent developments in the field that have led some people to think there may be a slowing of progress maybe a slowing in the actual rate of progress. Why don't you talk about that a little?
Sure. So I think the thing that makes it hard to talk about this is there's such a huge range of people's views from people who think in like 3 to 5 years, we're going to have super intelligence that's smarter than humans and it's going to take over or put everybody out of work. That's like one extreme. And then there's people who say, this is glorified autocomplete and there's really nothing new here, etc. And like those are so different that if your view is somewhere in the middle, you're like a skeptic relative to the first person, but still. So I think of myself as pretty optimistic about AI in the sense that I think it might be as important as the internet or electricity or the internal combustion engine, all of which had pretty transformational effects on human society, but it didn't totally transform human society in 3 to 5 years, partly because it just takes a long time. Society is big and complex and there's a lot of moving parts. And so even a very transformative technology, it takes 10, 20, 30 years for people to find the best ways to use the technology and build new kinds of organizations and so forth. So I guess that's my view, is that I think I think across the broad public, across the general public, I think people are probably underestimating it. But I think the small community of people inside the AI industry, especially people building this technology, and the community of like AI doomers are wildly overestimating. I don't think anything like totally transformational is going to happen in the next, say, 3 years. But 10 to 20 years, I think it's going to have a big impact. Certainly going to be the biggest thing of this decade. So then specifically what's happened in the last couple of years.
Now, wait a second, Tim. I got to say that saying within 20 years it'll be the biggest thing of this decade is not a very grand projection of the magnitude. So just to be clear, you are saying eventually this will be as important as electricity and so on. But
I think it very well could be, yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think it'll be much more important than that, but and maybe we'll get into that. But that's just for the sake of clarity. So anyway, keep going. Sorry.
Yeah. So the specific thing that's happened in the last year or so is if we had been talking a year ago, I mean, we were talking a year ago, and the view people had was you had this model GPT-4 where they made it 10 times as big as GPT-3, and it had 10 times as much training data, and therefore it was like this big jump in capabilities. And the view was in a year or two we'll have GPT-5, which is going to be another maybe 10x as large a model, another 10 times as much data, and you'll have another big, broad increase in capabilities where you'll have a new model that can kind of do everything better. And I think it's now pretty clear that that's not what's going to happen. What's happened instead is that these models, they actually have built the bigger models, and there's been reporting that those bigger models have not met expectations. They are a little better, but not a lot better. But what they found instead is they have a new technique that uses reinforcement learning to focus on optimizing abilities in problems where it's easy to generate problems with known answers. So math, computer coding are the main ones. And so you can create a bunch of synthetic training data that says, here's a math problem, here's the answer, and then you use a different training technique to make it really, really good at that.
This is chain of thought you're talking about?
Yeah, so these new...
Okay, so these are so-called reasoning. It's adding an explicit dimension of reasoning to the old, to the LL, large language model as it existed with GPT-4. And so far, OpenAI has a version 01, then 03. Google unveiled a kind of preliminary version, I would say. But anyway, so that's what you're talking about. Go ahead.
Yeah, so GPT-4, you used to be able to ask it to, quote unquote, think step by step. And then rather than just giving the answer, it would tell you its reasoning steps. And that would, it would then give you a better answer if you asked it to do this. And so 01, 03, Google's new thinking model, they're an extension of that, where rather than just thinking for a few tokens, it can go for hundreds and hundreds of tokens thinking through the problem. And that allows it to do things like some problems, you have to like try a possible solution and then realize it's wrong and backtrack and try a different solution and then backtrack and try again. There are ways you can, the way a person, if you're thinking through a hard problem, you often have to take many steps. And traditional GPT-4 was not good at that, but these new models are good at that. And so, particularly the 03 model that was announced in December and is due out in late January or February, that model was able to solve some very difficult mathematical problems that that other models hadn't been able to do. And they also that model was also able to solve a benchmark called ARC that was it's a clever kind of benchmark where it involves just little grids of colored pixels. And there's a pattern that says, here's an input, here's an output. And the usual pattern, like sometimes maybe you put a pink dot above every blue dot or something like that. And previously, this was invented in 2019. It's one of the few benchmarks that none of the models had been able to solve. And 03 did very well on it. And so This was very impressive.
In fact, did well enough in principle to qualify for the $1 million prize associated with that threshold, but technically didn't qualify. I don't know, because the amount of computer, because it wasn't open source, but anyway, it had been a very, it had been a threshold, a much aspired to goal, and it met it. But go ahead.
And so I think the old model was we're going to have these broad models that steadily get better at everything as we scale up compute and training. The new model is we now have these models that are very, very good at specific things, are maybe progressing faster than people expected on math and computer programming. But if you ask it to, say, analyze a legal brief or proofread an article, things like that, these models are basically no better than, or not very much better than GPT-4. And so I think people have different reactions to this. The optimists say, well, this is even faster progress, and hopefully we can take this progress in math and somehow apply it to all these other models. Whereas the pessimists say, well, okay, now you're doing really, really well at something computers have traditionally been good at, math. But the promise of these models was that it would kind of be good at everything. Right. And instead we have amazing progress in one area and a slowing of progress in a lot of other areas.
Okay. So let me, first of all, back up, and for people who aren't following this very closely, put kind of a little bit of a finer point on some of the things you said about where we are in this, and then offer kind of a counter argument. So yeah, the idea had been that as of a year or two ago, that these so-called scaling laws were going to catapult us from GPT-4 to levels models to something much more amazing fairly shortly. And by the scaling laws, what they meant was that if you increase, and this is during the phase that I'll call training, because the technical phrase pre-training, I'm sorry, makes no sense at all. Mm-hmm. But it's what people think of as training. When you're training it on the gobs of text and you're first giving shape to the mind, then there are these other phases, reinforcement learning and so on. But the idea was that if you increase the amount of data that you feed in during training, the amount of text, and so on, and you increase the amount of compute, like the number of chips involved in the training, the duration of the training, and I guess the number of neurons in the models themselves. I guess that's implied too, although neurons aren't actual physical things; they function as if they were. And the idea was, that's all you got to do is keep scaling. It was this had been observed. It was what blew people away in the first place. As you got from GP2 to 3, people in the field were like, oh my God, we just added more scale and it's a whole new kind of thing. And that was true. At the same time, I kind of wondered even then, as I think other people did, well, first of all, look, you kind of have trained it on the whole internet. So where are you going to get more text? And there is an answer to that, so-called synthetic data, whatever. But also I kind of thought, what more would you want from this, in a certain sense, in terms of what this is good at, and what amazes me about it, which is that it knows anything, and you can talk to it as if it were a person. You can say, explain this to me, and it says something, and you follow up with a question, and it's as if you're talking to the world's greatest expert. I was kind of like, how could it get any better at this? Now, there were things it was famously bad at, it knows, you say, who is Tom Hanks's mother? And it gives you her name. And you say, or maybe it was Tom Cruise was a famous example, but in any event. And then you say, and who is so-and-so, and repeat the name of the mother, or who is so-and-so's son, and repeats the name of the mother. And they can't say Tom Hanks, right? So there's very elementary things. Or if you say, it knows how to win at tic-tac-toe, but if you, I want you to intentionally lose, a lot of them couldn't do that. So this kind of very elementary reasoning they couldn't do. And, as you said, there was this thing like reason step by step that seemed to improve that a little. That had itself been a kind of discovery of some people at Google who did a big paper on it. But in any event, it seemed, you're right. There's been this reporting that scale per se has failed to do the job, and I want to. So kind of that's where we are. Before I get into my counter argument, I want to ask you a couple things about the scale per se thing. One
Mhm.
is kind of puzzles me. You're right. There's been a lot of reporting. It seems to be the case. It would account for the fact that there's still no GPT-5 if scale in the training phase is not having miraculous effects. But did you listen to Dario Amodei? He is the CEO of Anthropic, one of the main people in the field. It's one of the main companies in the field. Did you hear his Lex Friedman conversation a couple months ago? I
Yes, I
thought
did.
I thought he said forcefully and explicitly that these reports are false. Scaling in this traditional, and I thought he was talking about the training phase because there is, I mean, one response. Well, part of the counter response will be here's a plot spoiler, which you've heard, is okay. Those scaling laws may be dying or dead, but this reasoning stuff, you know, there's going to be scaling laws there on the so-called inference side of the compute. In other words, not the amount of compute required to build the model, but the amount consumed every time you use it and ask it a question. And there are implications, social implications of that being where a lot of the compute goes, by the way. But and people say, and there will be laws of scale there. That's the next place they're going to start adding more compute, refining the techniques, and that's gonna and so the progress will in effect continue as we add true reasoning ability to these models. And that's so I'll let you reply to that counter. But first, my question is: didn't Dario Amodei say he either said or strongly implied that no, the old-fashioned laws of scale are holding, and in other words, in the training phase, and now the reporting is actually inside all these big labs. They've known for some time they're not holding. That's the sense I'm getting, right?
Yeah, I don't remember Dario specifically saying that traditional scaling approach was holding. I mean, Anthropic has had a similar. You say GPT-5 hasn't come out yet. Anthropic had a similar pattern where when they released Claude 3, which is their main chatbot, they had three levels. They had Opus, which was a big one, Sonnet, which is a mid one, and Haiku, which is a small one. Then when they released version 3.5, there was no Opus. And this was 6 months ago. They released Sonnet, they released Haiku, which is the medium and small one. There was no big one. There's still no big one. They asked him about that, and he kind of hemmed and hawed. He said, yes, we still expect to release it, but wouldn't say when, wouldn't say by the end of the year. I mean, their website had said coming in 2024. So they clearly have pushed it back. And the reporting suggests they actually did train Opus. And the problem they had is it was better than the previous version. But the difficulty they have is that when you make the models bigger, it's not only more expensive to train, it's also more expensive to use. If the model is 10 times bigger, it costs 10 times more per token. And so if it's only a little bit better than the medium-sized model, but it costs 10 times as much, it's not worth using. So I would guess that the scaling laws are still working in the technical sense that the error per token is still going down at a predictable rate, but that reduction of the error rate is not significant enough to have much actual utility to customers, given you have to pay 10 times as much for the bigger model. And so it's not that. So I think you could literally say this quote unquote scaling law is working, but the scaling law is on something people don't directly care about, which is accuracy predicted next token. Whereas what you care about is something bigger, of like able to understand larger concepts, able to have lower rates of hallucination, et cetera, which is not exactly what's being measured. And I think that just the pace of progress is proving not to be fast enough. And so what the labs are actually doing is they're taking these larger models and using them to generate training data for these O1 models that have a kind of different approach. And so they are still useful. They're just useful internally as opposed to being a product.
I think sometimes they're actually using them also to administer some reinforcement learning, right? To give feedback to the smaller machines. But okay, so and how about like this particular dimension of the pushback? And to put it a slightly different way, like as I said, these models were already pretty amazing at the non-reasoning part. Like they know everything, they understand your questions very subtly, and they seem to be, and they're responsive enough to like give you career advice and do a bunch of incredible stuff pretty damn well. So like I wasn't really looking for a whole lot more on that front. It would be good if A, the rate of hallucination dropped, and B, they develop these reasoning skills, both in the realm of math and science, as you say, and I think you'd agree there is very impressive stuff happening there,
Yes,
and in the
absolutely.
realm of kind of common sense, tic tac toe, Tom Hanks's mother, and so on, and so I would say if they can, at a respectable pace, reduce the rate of hallucination, and it's true that this dimension of reasoning is going to fairly rapidly get better. I would say on balance, that is a continued, really substantial improvement of what we want from these things, right?
Yeah, no. So this again goes back to my original point about there's such a wide range of possible views about what's happening here, and I think it's not so much people overestimate the rate of progress; it's that they underestimate like how impressive the human brain is. And so, yeah, I think we're continuing to see steady progress towards more capable models. I think that's going to continue, but I think at the pace of progress we've seen over the last few years, my guess is it's probably 10 or 15 years away from human level. It's a very rough guess, rather than 3 to 5 years. And I think that a big part of what the models still lack is the ability to organize and abstract and synthesize large quantities of information. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm a reporter. I've been covering technology and AI for 20 years. And when I'm writing an article, I'm drawing on things I've learned over the last 20 years. Conversations I've had with people, articles and books I've read, previous thoughts I've had, previous articles I've written. And the current models, they have a technical limitation where, because of the way they work, there's a limit to how big their context window can be. And so I don't know what my 20-year career, how many tokens that would be, but it would be millions, probably tens or
And
hundreds of
we should
billions.
say the context window is kind of how much information they can kind of keep in mind, so to speak.
Yeah,
Like,
it's
for
their
example,
memory.
how long a
Yeah.
text how big a text can you feed it? Or how much of your conversation with it can it remember, and so on. So
Yeah,
anyway, go
yeah.
ahead.
So like with these chatbots, you'll use it for one thing, and then you'll close the window, or you'll hit new conversation. You'll turn a
Mm-hmm.
totally new one. You don't have one kind of personality that's the same one over the course of days and months and years that remembers, oh, 3 weeks ago we had this conversation, and I could apply information. So that's one thing that I think it's not good at, and is unlikely to be. And I think if people are thinking, oh, this is going to become a drop-in remote worker that can do jobs people do, many people's jobs involve keeping those contexts, remembering, oh, we had a meeting 6 months ago where so-and-so said such and
Mm-hmm.
such that was
Mm-hmm.
important. So that's one thing that I think they're still quite bad about at. They're also, I think, still pretty bad at geometric reasoning, reasoning about, spatial relationships. So I think there are, it's very impressive. It's made a lot of progress, but I think there are still some things. It's just human beings can do some pretty amazing things, and I think we're still
Yeah.
pretty far from reaching the point where it's
Yeah.
actually like comparable to what
Yeah.
humans can do.
True. I mean, to be clear, you can. I think you can. I can go back to my Claude interface and pick up a single conversation I was having 3 weeks ago, and as long as it's not too long conversation, it will remember that. Right? It's just
Right.
that there is an absolute limit that is smaller than the human absolute limit, but that's
Right.
getting bigger. That's been,
But but it's
Google
not
has
just the
pretty big.
absolute limit. So one of the most interesting studies I saw recently. So we were talking about the art competition, which was this puzzle thing where you have a grid of colored pixels and a relationship between input and output, and you're trying to say kind of what's the pattern. One of the things
Uh-huh.
they found is that they took one of those puzzles and just doubled it in size. So rather than 1 pixel of each color, you had 4 pixels of each color, and you showed it the otherwise identical puzzle. It was much worse at that. And I think that reflects the fact that these models they just have trouble with abstracting large amounts of information.
Mm-hmm.
If you give it kind of a simple problem where the information is all kind of in the four corners of the problem, it's very good at drawing the correct deductions from that information. But the real world's very messy. There's a lot of detail. Most of it's irrelevant. You have to kind of figure out what's the important bits from all the kind of noise. And I think these models get very easily confused when in those kind of naturalistic settings. And I think that's why one of the reasons you see when people try to take these models and just say, okay, now you're an AI doctor or you're a AI customer service representative or something, it sort of works in toy problems. But then when you give it like a real customer or patient or something, it kind of tends to underperform. And I think the reason is that in the benchmark thing, they give you just the information you need to solve the problem and not the, the small talk and the, noise from the ambulance driving by and, whatever. And like, so I think it's, I think that's what they're not good at yet, is that they are still kind of easily distracted by things that, by changes to the problem that humans would easily be able to say, oh, this is actually the same as that other thing.
Yeah. I one thing, this is just kind of a slightly tangential point, but, people talk about the differences between the way they think and the way we think. I'm quite struck by the similarities. Like when you look at this, adding the dimension of reasoning, it's like the problem with the reasoning is that it's like when you first ask it a question that requires some reasoning. Often it just says, people, some people are looking at this in a Danny Kahneman kind of system one, system two way. And they say, well, what it does when you give it a question that requires reasoning, it gives you I think it's system one that is quick and reflexive and not so thoughtful. That is what people do. I mean, people don't, as a rule, really reason very well by themselves. Like, especially like with ideological things. If you say, well, what about this? Well, most of us say, well, blah, 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 that. And upon examination, that was like a reflexive and not very smart thing to say and is susceptible to challenge. And that's why discussion among contending sides is so much more an efficient a way to get to truth, even if it's not like ideological, than just sitting there thinking, right? It's like you can sit there and think all day and then you'll have one conversation, you'll go, oh my God, that was very helpful. And it seems to me that the reasoning approach basically emulates that. I mean, the two best things for reasoning through something are to either have a critic of your reason or be good at internal criticism, be full of self-doubt. And it seems to me like that's almost literally what these reasoning systems do, as I understand it. It's almost like you can describe it as putting multiple LLMs in conversation or as having an internal critical monitor. But I think that's very much the dynamic that they're instantiating. And I think it's very much the way we do things. I'm just curious as your reaction to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a lot of things about these models that are similar to the way humans behave. I mean, people talk about, oh, these models have hallucinations. I mean, people have hallucinations. I mean, we say things we don't mean,
Absolutely.
Or we kind of get confused all the time.
Or we just say kind of whatever we've heard other people saying, which is a lot of what it does.
Yeah, but I think the difference is that people have, as I think the system one, system two thing is good. Like if somebody like says something kind of quickly without thinking about it too hard, they might say a slightly wrong thing. But then if you say, hey, did you really mean this? And they think about it, there actually is some kind of structure in their brain where they actually can think through it more carefully and say, oh, I really meant that, or I really didn't mean that. If you ask the AI model to correct themselves, they will say, oh, I'm sorry, I got it wrong. But then they might give you another wrong thing. Like there are certain kinds of problems where they just don't have the ability to think really carefully and systematically. And I think that's a function of the way they kind of store their information. Everything they know is a single stream of tokens that they have to look back to. And they don't have any kind of higher level. I think about like a database or a data structure that says, oh, here are the people and places and things I understand with like relationships between them. And yeah, I think it's as a result of that, they get, if they have to think about too many things at the same time or think about too complicated problems, they just have a tendency to get confused. And,
I mean, they do
kind of wander off track.
They do have an existing infrastructure of things and concepts they quote understand the relationship among.
That's right.
But they know like Golden Gate Bridge being a famous example for reasons we won't get into. But so
anything that was well represented in their training data, yes, they have they have kind of an intuitive understanding of how those things relate to each other. But this is another, I think, example of like the difference between the real world versus the training. often if you have like an employee and you bring them in a new company, there's a lot of proprietary information specific to that company that you have to learn before you're able to be useful. And most of that information won't be in the training data you give to AI because it's proprietary, like companies are not publishing it. And I think a common thing you'll see if you hire somebody straight out of college and put them in a new job, it'll take several months before they're actually doing useful work because there's so much kind of background knowledge they need to incorporate into their brains and into their kind of how they understand the world. And people don't have this sharp distinction between training time and inference time. Anytime you're learning, you are kind of incorporating what you learn into your kind of long-term understanding of how the world works.
Yeah.
Whereas these AI models, there's the training time where they learn all these concepts. But then in inference time, if you introduce a totally new concept and give it some examples, it's not very good at incorporating that into its conceptual understanding of how the world works.
But, I mean, you know more about this than I do, but I gather that one thing that's being developed as all this capital is sunk into creating actually useful applications of this stuff and, little subspecies of AI is that there are various ways to, in effect, do supplementary training, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I don't know the details, but I think companies, I mean, even Google Notebook LM is a kind of workaround. It's a finite space. You can feed in, several books worth of shit and say, okay, this is kind of added to your universe of knowledge. But anyway, that aside, that's not training. That's not retraining. You're right. But can't you increasingly do a kind of supplementary training that
yeah, so there is a process called fine-tuning where you can basically do additional training, you give it more information. But that's like kind of a technical thing. You need like an engineer to do that. And it's still it's a separate process.
Isn't that changing? Aren't they trying to make that a more accessible, user-friendly? I just assume they are. I mean,
they're trying to make it from a kind of product perspective. Yeah, they're trying to make it easier for companies to do that. But it's still very different from people envision you can just like put your chatbot into a meeting and have it talk to people. And then like a human, it just like from the conversation, it understands it. And that's not how fine-tuning works. So for fine-tuning, there's kind of this separate process where you have to have an engineer like load a bunch of documents. And so, I mean, it's very possible that the way you'll kind of get these models to human level is you will pull those kind of things together and have a very easy way to say, okay, go into fine-tuning mode, and then we'll have you do some training and then go back to inference mode. But it's just not, it's just different from what humans do. I think what humans do is much more flexible, which is that you don't have to kind of flip that switch and say, okay, now we're in training mode, now we're in like problem solving mode. It's just, it just always does both at the same time. And so, again, I'm not saying it's not going to get there. I'm not saying that the progress is not impressive. It's just like the human brain's very impressive. And I just think we're still quite a number of years away from truly being able to do all the things that the human brain can do.
Yeah. Now, quickly, the other dimension, I mean, before long, we're going to go into overtime, which will be accessible to paid subscribers, NonZero newsletter. But let's talk a little more first. The other major form of pushback I'm inclined to give you, aside from emphasizing this reasoning thing, which does seem to me a possibly very important avenue, it is multimodality. Okay, you know what I mean. Of course, it is the integration of along with the text interface of video, audio, and so on. There have been rudimentary forms of this for a while. I mean, even though Google's not, I think, as advanced as OpenAI on this, for some time I've been able to take my smartphone and go into my backyard and say, what kind of tree is this? Have a follow-up conversation, or it looks like something's wrong with this tree, and blah, blah, blah. But now we're getting really, when you get the multimodal models, where I gather that are trained along the several sensory avenues, the training itself is coming from the different avenues, right? Audio, video, so on. Then you get the ability to have, for example, these interactive conversations. I mean, you can dial 1-800-CHAT-GPT if anybody hasn't done it, and it's pretty lifelike. And And, you know, in principle, all of the sensory avenues work like this, that you feed a bunch of data in and it learns to treat the data somewhat the way humans treat not just audio video data, but tactile data in principle. That's a tougher challenge, but and is critical to robotics, true sensitive robotics, of course. Um, but you know, and interestingly, you know, they have found. I don't think they could have confidently predicted this, but that you know, when the stuff from the different avenues intersects kind of synergistically. I mean, in other words, like I mentioned Golden Gate Bridge. Of course, Anthropic did this little Golden Gate Claude demonstration where they were showing that they can kind of fiddle with a personality, and they showed you what happens when it's just obsessed with the Golden Gate Bridge. The other thing they noted in that paper is that, you know, of course, first of all, I would say doing that, fiddling with the knobs, means you're kind of you're getting a better sense for where certain kinds of concepts are represented in the machine. Like, okay, this set of neural activations seems to correspond to the Golden Gate Bridge. Anyway, they reported in the paper that when they showed a picture of the Golden Gate Bridge, it's like basically the same set of neural activations as if the stuff had come in through text. And I think they're getting a lot of what's called like cross-modal transfer or something. I mean, there is, you know, the kind of synergistic interaction of our senses that really is a big part of understanding the world, right? Like, is seeming to happen in these machines. And I think that's potentially huge. And I think, of course, multimodality, just at the level of applications and at the level of impact on life, is a very important thing. You'd probably agree, right? But
yeah, absolutely. No, I think the progress on multimodal models has been impressive. You were mentioning robotics. I mean, one of the really interesting results from the last couple of years is that if they take one of these pre-trained language models that understands images and text, and they kind of connect it up to a robot, they can actually do things like say, like they'll have some flags on the table and say, take this object and set it on France. And it will know that, oh, that's the French flag, having never like trained it specifically on this, just based on the knowledge it has from having seen images of French flags in its pre-training data. And so that's really cool. And I think that this is going to be really important as we try to build more capable models that can do things in the real world, the ability to not only recognize images, but reason about physical space, et cetera. That'll be really important, and it'll be good that we don't have to explicitly program that all in. We can take knowledge from one domain and apply it to another. All that said, I think that the models we have now are limited in some important ways. I've been playing recently with the OpenAI live, I forget, the advanced voice mode, I guess they call it, and they just enabled the video part of that. So it used to be, if you wanted to show ChatGPT a picture, you'd have to take a picture and upload it, and it would do a picture.
Right.
Now you can just turn video on and just wave your phone around, and it'll just see whatever you point the phone on. So that's really cool. And so I've been trying to use that for various kind of toy problems. And so one thing I did is, chatbots are not very good at counting. If you pointed at a picture of, say, 10 apples and say, how many apples are this? It often will say 9 or 11. Right. So I tried that, but I had it look like 8, and it can usually get 8. So I said, how many are there? There's 8. Then I took 2 away, but I said, okay, I took one away. How many are there now? And this is 7. I did it again. I took 2 away, said I took 2 more. I took 1 away. It said 6. So there would be like 4 on the table. But I had said words that implied there were 6, and it would say 6. And I got all the way down to there was like 1, and it said there were 5. Another example, I was in.
Did you post that video on? You should get some social media traction out of that. It sounds like.
Yeah. So I'm. One of my next articles will be about this. And yeah, maybe I need to figure out if I can make a video of it. Another example, I tried just starting in one room in my house. I'm telling it, okay, I'm going to walk to another room, walking very slowly, kind of narrating as I go by. And then I said, okay, now tell me how to get back to the first room. And it said, well, go back the way you came. And I said, well, should I turn right or left? It just said it would refuse to give any directions. Like it has no like spatial awareness at all, even though it just saw me go through these steps. And so in some ways, it's very impressive. I mean, obviously, the fact that you can just point it at an object and say, what is this? And it can tell you, that's really cool. But there's also other things that it just is very, very rudimentary at. And another thing I thought would be cool, like actually an application I would find very useful, is I just kind of slowly panned over my bookshelf and said, I'm looking for such and such a book. Stop me when you see it or let me know if you see it. And it was just extremely random. Sometimes it would say it was there when it wasn't. Sometimes it would say what it wasn't when I was. I'd say, like, what does it look like? It would give me the wrong color. And so for whatever reason, these models are, it's very jagged. There's some things they're very good at. There's some things they're bad at. But
the jagged frontier is a term that Ethan Mollick is pushing, which is a good term.
Yeah, exactly. But what I guess I take away from it is, like, humans have a pretty robust set of abstract representations for the world that underlies what, the words we say have something kind of backing them up. And AI models, sometimes you could say there's something like that, but there's other cases where they're just kind of winging it. And I don't think we figured out how to build those kind of robust representations. And so I think we probably will eventually. I think there's probably 1 or 2 or 3 more kind of major breakthroughs we're going to need before we have something that's kind of robustly human level across a pretty wide range of tasks.
Okay. So listen, the time has come to go into overtime. And you've, Tim, been kind enough to agree to stick around for much more conversation. It's available to paid subscribers of NonZero newsletter. You can become one by going to NonZero Substack, clicking on the post associated with this for one thing, and once you're a paid subscriber, there you can either just view it or listen to it right there, or you can set up your own little special podcast feed so that you'll always have access to these. And there's other stuff, a lot of print content, as we used to say. Actually, we didn't use the word content, but we used to use the word print. That's also will become accessible to you. Thanks to everybody who's listened so far. I again want to say check out Tim's newsletter, Understanding AI. And now check out his podcast, which is called, Tim?
AI Summer. It's at aisummer.org.
Inside a reference to something that was called AI Winter, I assume, where a long period of very slow progress in AI that even you would agree kind of has ended, I think.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No, yes. Yeah. There's been several of them. There's one, I think, in the 70s and then another one in the late 90s, early 2000s, where some early hype would not fail to materialize. And so then kind of research funding would dry up. And so, people talk about these AI winters. And so the opposite of that is an AI summer, which I absolutely think we're in one of those right now.
So, by the way, in overtime, I'm going to, I have devastating pushback. I think, I forget what, I have devastating pushback. But also I'm going to ask you if this scaling issue is bad news for Elon Musk. I would love to hear it is, but I'm curious as to your thoughts. Okay, so thanks everybody who's listened this far. I hope you'll follow us into overtime.